I'll get to my text in a moment, found in Ephesians Chapter 5. But over on the Ohio River, west of Morgantown, there is a mission agency, and they bring Filipino missionaries from the Philippines, and they train them for a year in basic theology and Baptist beliefs, and then these men will go and they'll stay here for 4 or 5 months, and they will attempt to get some support while they're here. And we support 4 of them, by the way. But when they came, they were asking for $10 a month from 30 churches, which would be $300 a month, and that's what they could survive on quite well in the Philippines. And we've passed all that away, and we support them now. We raised it to $25 a month, and inflationary reasons and other reasons. But I have noticed over the years that when those men would come, when we've had probably a couple dozen of them or near that into our church over the years, not able to support all of them, they would say, my dad or my mom was saved by a missionary from the United States. Or they would say, I got saved because a missionary came from the United States with the gospel. And that's why I'm saved, and that's why my family is saved, and I'm here training to go back to be a missionary to my own people. And I want to tell you that there is a great cause in the Philippines, a great open door, and there are many churches being established and many being built. I have a little story I want to tell you before I get into my text about a missionary named Sonny Dix. He was about 60 miles south of the city. They've been out buying things, and they came back into the city, and he pulled into a filling station, and the missionary had a man from the church with him. And he went inside to talk to the filling station attendant, and a little boy, 4 years old, came out where the pumps were, and he began to beg. He was begging for money. And in the Philippines, there's a lot of kids that are professional beggars, and that their parents are out there behind and saying, you go take your cup and beg money, and then they take the money back to their parents. So the first thing you do in the Philippines, as in other parts of the world, you ask this kid, where did you sleep last night? So they asked this little 4-year-old boy where he slept, and he said, that truck over there. And it was a gasoline truck. It hauled gasoline. And the missionary said, you mean you slept in the truck? He said, no, I slept under the truck. And so he went home and talked to his wife, and they said, we need to do something for this boy. He'd been there for 2 months. And so they called the right agency, and they wanted to find out if anybody had turned this boy in for begging. And they said, yeah, we know about that boy. He's living there in the filling station. He's been there for about 2 months, and he really came from the south, and his dad brought him up to the city and dumped him off there. And he said his dad used to get drunk, and he would burn him with cigarettes. And then he and his brother, and he would hang him by the neck from a rope, and right before they died, he would cut him down. And he just couldn't take care of this boy, so he brought him into the big city and left him there to beg. And the social service worker said, we can't take him in. The government doesn't have any money. And this missionary Dix had a mission orphanage, and they said, can't you take him in? He said, we don't have any money. We don't have any funds. We're broke. Can you take him in? They did. They took him into that mission orphanage, and his wife washed his hair, washed the lice out, got rid of the lice, and bathed him. He had greased all over his body from dropping down off the motor of that truck. And they said they put him to bed that night, and he slept for 14 hours, never woke up. And I have a picture of him here when he was in his rags, and then I have a picture of him after he got saved. He's 7 years old, and they said he woke up the next morning after 14 years old, after sleeping 14 hours, and he was just smiling all over, and said he's never stopped smiling since. And that's the result of one missionary reaching one little boy named Dong with the gospel and loving people. And we're just so glad we can support those missionaries, and it's a wonderful opportunity and privilege that we have to do that. I want you to take your Bibles and turn to Ephesians Chapter 5, and I want to speak to you tonight on the great burden that you and I have about praying for missionaries. And I'm reading from chapter 6 and verse 18, and I'll be reading several of those verses to you. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 18. This is the Apostle Paul telling us what he does. It said, praying always with all prayer and supplication, and wanting these Ephesians to do that in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. And all those words indicating prayer life. And for me, Paul the missionary, pray for me that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in bonds, and therein I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. And so Paul is challenging those people in the church at Ephesus to pray for him. Now, missionaries don't need pity, they need prayer. Right. And they need consistent prayer, and they need fervent prayer, and they need intelligent prayer. And that's why we need to read missionary letters and find out, even in a condensed form, what their needs are, and direct our prayers at their needs. And don't ever be guilty of praying those very carnal, misguided prayers where you said, Lord, save the whole world, or bless all the missionaries. And we don't pray prayers like that. The first mission agency in the United States was among Baptists, known as the Triennial Convention that happened in Philadelphia back in 1814. And the purpose was to assist Baptist churches like this, like ours, in fulfilling the Great Commission across the seas. And so that set off in America the mission agencies that began to get out the gospel around the world. Somebody asked this question: do you have permission, God's permission, to stay at home? And that is a question that I've tried to answer over the years that I've been in the ministry. And there's a way you have to stay honest with yourself. And the way I would stay honest with myself, and I don't know that I ever told my wife this, I may have said it in a sermon, but the way I stayed honest with myself and with God was, Lord, if you want me to be a missionary, I'll be a missionary. And I kept saying that, God, if you want me to be one, I will go there. Because I want to not just sing these songs, I don't want to just read the verses, I want to surrender all to the Lord and go wherever he wants me to go and be that kind of a missionary. Now, missionaries, they face a lot of very difficult problems, and many of which I don't understand, and perhaps you don't understand. But prayer is very important, as important, if not more so, than money for our missionaries, as I said this morning. And Paul was a great missionary pastor, a missionary evangelist, a servant, successful before God. And when you read Paul's epistles, he seldom mentioned money, but many, many times he mentioned prayer. Let me give you some of the prayers that he asked people to pray for him. Striving together with me in your prayers. Then he said, continue in prayer. And he said, may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Again, he said, making mention of you in our prayers, that may turn to my deliverance through your prayer. He said again, you also helping together by prayer for us. We're really, you can't go to the mission field perhaps, but you can help missionaries by praying for them. Paul says it here very plainly. And then he gives us a command, brethren, pray for us. And again, praying also for us that God would open unto us a door. And I don't need to really powerfully convince you that we are scripturally obligated to pray for those who are out on the fields of the world, and to remind you and exhort you that you need to pray for them. There's a long list of great missionaries and the great sacrifices they have made. And one of the ways that I keep stirred up about missions is I read stories about Adoniram Judson and William Carey and David Brainerd and Hudson Taylor and David Livingston and Peter Cartwright. By the way, Peter Cartwright was an American. And as the frontier moved west, Peter Cartwright was a Methodist preacher, and he moved west with it. And he was a rough, tough, corncob type man, and probably you would say he would fight at the drop of a hat. And he knew, by the way, Joseph Smith out on the frontier, the founder of Mormonism. But Jim Elliot, the one I mentioned this morning, Nate Saint, another one of those missionaries in Ecuador, and C.T. Studd, probably the greatest missionary book I ever read. If you want to read the life of a very powerfully dedicated man. Read the story of C.T. Studd. It was the most moving mission story I ever read, and a host of others. And many of those we have in our church library, and I wanted to make sure that we get those books in our library. And then there are tens of thousands of people who are unknown heroes, unsung heroes who've been out there serving the Lord. Bishop Hazen Warner tells of a young couple who went to India as missionaries, and they worked there a few years, and the husband became very ill, and it became evident very soon that the husband was going to die. And the wife, she just couldn't handle it. She couldn't bring herself to accept these very awful circumstances. And so one day her husband pulled her aside and said, "Honey," she said, "God, called us here to show these people how to live. But he also called us here to show them how to die." And you think about the great opportunity that we have now to show them and not just tell them that there's something greater out there beyond this life, and that if God takes my life, that you ought to be able to handle it and show these people that we know how to die as well to live. And she got her life together and came to accept the circumstances. And when we're really totally dedicated to the Lord, everything that happens in our life, whether it appears to be defeat or not, there's something in it for us to glorify God by. Amen. And long as it's not the result of our sin, and something beyond our control and beyond the circumstances that we have control of, we can get something out of it that will glorify God. So behind these missionaries were prayers and paydays coming from God's people, fruit abounding, as missionaries often say, to the account of those who prayed and gave. And we know there have been quitters and dropouts along the way, the John Marks and the Demases I mentioned this morning, but some of those get turned around. But we've had our share of missionaries that for various reasons left the field and forsook the battle, and we were hurt by it, and we were a little bit discouraged by it, and we wonder about it. And sometimes it's not all the missionaries' fault, and sometimes maybe it is that we don't really pray for them like we should. But my point is that we can make a difference in the lives of missionaries by praying for them. The gospel is good news, one missionary said, only if it gets to them in time. And if it doesn't get there in time, it's not. Having heard and believed the gospel makes us debtors to get it out. I can honestly say that I love missionaries, and I love to be around them, and I wish we could support all the missionaries that ever called me, but that we sadly can't do that. Roy Lauren tells about a Christian missionary that was in Korea who was traveling, a businessman that was traveling there, wasn't a missionary, and in a field beside the road, he noticed these two men out there, and the old man was behind the plow, and the young man was up there pulling the plow. And this businessman was amused, and he took a picture of them, and he said, "This is really curious." He said, "I suppose these people are very poor." And he said this to the missionary who was an interpreter and guide for this party of businessmen. And the missionary said, "Yes, very quietly, these men are very poor, but they happen to be Christians." And when their church was being built, they were eager to give something toward it. But they didn't have any money, and the only thing they had was an ox. And they gave this ox. And they said, next year we'll pull the plow ourselves and give the proceeds to the church from the sale of the oxen. And the businessman was silent for a moment. He didn't have much to say. And he said, when I get back to the United States, he said, I am going to do things a little differently. He said, I am going to take this picture to my pastor and show it to him and tell him all about what I saw. And he said, I'm going to double my giving to the church and do some home plow work myself. And he did. He went home and doubled his missions giving. We sometimes don't realize all the battles missionaries face, and it is really criminal to send our money and not send our prayers after them. They have health, medical problems. We talked about this a little bit last night. I read this a couple of years ago, in some very prestigious magazine, but they said the number one killer of people in the world is malaria, mosquito biting people, and very serious. And missionaries on many foreign fields face exposure to malaria. No local doctors, 100 or more miles away, poorly trained doctors. sometimes very primitive hospitals. If you could have seen the hospital I went into in India, you would shake your head in amazement. It was just, there was a very busy street out here, and there were no doors into the hospital area. It was just, there was a wall back there, and it was fairly well exposed, and there was a curtain sort of marking it off as a separate area. And we went in to see a man named Pastor Moses. And Pastor Moses was dying, and that it wasn't even a dispensary. And here were all these patients lined up along the wall. There were no IVs. There was no clean tables. It was a dirt floor. But that was their hospital where Pastor Moses was dying in India. And many times missionaries face those very primitive hospital conditions. And it's very difficult, especially after they've been exposed to the very advanced medical care that they get in the Western world. And, in Morgantown, we have a training hospital there for doctors. And I read several years ago that there are more doctors per capita in Morgantown than any city in the United States. And many of them stay there. I mean, there's dispensaries all over Morgantown. We have 3 hospitals, and there's just a lot of medical care available. But that's not true for missionaries. And let me revise the figures I gave you this morning because I read it more directly this afternoon. Judson buried 5 children and 3 wives in Burma, and it was malaria infested. And some missionaries have children that need very specialized care. We supported a missionary years ago. He had to come back to the States once every year just to get treatments for his son. The storage of blood and penicillin and other medicines are impossible or impractical. They have language barriers in most lands. A year of schooling, sometimes it takes 2 years to learn the language, and the continual use and practice, they've got to go through that. A lot of hard work. Somebody said, how do you know when you've really conquered a foreign language on the mission field? And the missionary said, I knew I'd conquered it when I began to think in it. And he said, I know I'd really conquered it when I dreamed in it. So then it's really inculcated into your psyche, and you know that you've arrived. And some children, most children learn languages very easy, but it's very difficult for parents to learn them. And then they have constant combinations that you're not accustomed to saying, and rolling your tongue and making guttural sounds and labial sounds that you just can't do easily because you're not accustomed to doing them like that language is. Very difficult. And we need to pray for missionaries. And most every missionary that goes to the foreign field, the number one prayer request they have is, pray that I'll learn the language. Pray that I'll learn the language. And there's 4 or 5 missionaries right now that I'm praying for that God would help them to learn the language. And then I mentioned this briefly this morning, but it is true that these missionaries go into backward cultures that are much lower standards of living, and they have truly all those sights and sounds and smells, and they do have culture shock, and it's very difficult, especially for the ladies. And they have unrefrigerated meat, and I've seen it in marketplaces around the world with flies crawling across the meat, and they go to the marketplace and buy it like that. And they take the bus or they walk, and they go grocery shopping not once a week but every day because they don't have any way to store their supplies. And they have no shower, hot bath as we have it, and they have different clothing styles and different color skin and no window screens. That was one of the most difficult things for me in India to get used to and living there was no window screens. I mean, the mosquitoes, they just come in and they'll eat you wholesale. And sometimes you get a hole in your mosquito net and they'll find that little hole and they'll get in and chew on you. But very difficult. Different systems of etiquette that they must get accustomed to. Adjusting to this different culture may take months or a year or 2 years. And some of them never adjust to it. They come home. And we had a missionary come home because his wife couldn't adjust to it. And she I don't know if she couldn't, but she didn't. And finally, he had to come home. Then there's a problem of family separation. When you're young, you go away from your parents and your brothers and your sisters. And when you're older, you're away from your children and your grandchildren. And, David Brainerd came here from Scotland to the American Indians, and he fell in love with Jonathan Edwards' daughter. And he finally made a choice that was very difficult, to break off that relationship and go to the wilds and reach the Indians. And he came home to Northampton, Massachusetts, very sick and very weak. And at 29 years of age, he died in Jonathan Edwards' house. never getting to fulfill his missionary life the way he wanted to. You know, it would be very painfully difficult for me to leave my wife and my children, or just leave my children and my grandchildren. I think that's probably the reason why Paul remained a eunuch and unmarried, that he might, without distraction, serve the Lord. And some missionaries, go 4 years without seeing their children. I've tried to, in my mind, find some solution to that. Maybe if they came home every 6 months instead of every 2 years or every 4 years, but that's very expensive, and who can afford to do that? They're not financially able to. Missionaries battle loneliness, being an alien 24 hours a day, and fighting the temptation to quit. They have financial burdens, inflation, dollar devaluation. We have missionaries in Japan. They've been there for about 30 years, Ralph and Janet Burchell. And Ralph is from Point Marion, Pennsylvania, just outside of Morgantown. They've been godly, faithful missionaries all those years, and they came home about 5 or 6 years ago to bury an aunt, Ralph was her only relative, and she was in her 90s, and he came home and took care of her affairs and made sure she got buried, and just been very, very faithful. And so many times we had to raise their support because they were so bothered by devaluation of the dollar against the yen. And sometimes churches drop their support, and they have emergencies arise. And I thank the Lord, we have never, in 40 years of supporting missionaries, never one time failed to send a missionary their support. Sometimes it might have been forgotten or something, or a typographic or an error some way in the office, but we have never failed to send those missionaries their support. And another reason we must pray for them is that God will answer our prayers and help those missionaries that need our help. And when missionaries ask for prayer, let me tell you, they really need it. It's not some flimsy thing with them. And some go under-supported. You know why they go to the field under-supported? Because they love the Lord. They want to get over there. They want to serve the Lord. And some missionaries can't work on foreign fields. They can't get a card. No tent making is allowed. And whatever they have coming from the States is all they have. But somehow, wonderfully, God answers our prayers and takes care of them. They face problems with the education of their children. We had a missionary in Brazil years ago that their children were 600 miles away up to the northern coast of Brazil. And the wife had a very difficult time with that. Would you send a second grader 600 miles away from you just to go to school? And they wrestled with that. And homeschooling is very hard work when you're dealing with all the other problems in the mission field. And then the money for education. But I remember they sent their children up to Fortaleza on the northern coast of Brazil. And they had to bring them home. She could not stand being away from her children like that. And then there's the anti-American sentiment. To some people, Americans are imperialist pigs. And I don't care if you're number one in the world as a nation, no matter who number one is, they don't like you. And they will say things against you. They will laugh at foreign kids. I remember being in Bangkok, Thailand one time. There was a missionary there, and he said, I used to send my kids down to the corner grocery store there, to go down to the market to buy things, and they would go down there on a daily basis. But he said because their skin was white, the kids in the neighborhood didn't like them. They started throwing rocks at them, picking on them. And he said, I had to stop sending my kids down there to buy groceries because they're different. And somehow, it's a little bit ingrained in a lot of people, or maybe most people. If somebody's different from us, we don't like them. And it certainly was true in Bangkok. And to some people, we're the rich, snobbish Americans that think we know everything and earn everything and had everything. And I've directed a couple of trips to Israel, and I tell people before we go, and I put it in the literature that I put out, when you go to Europe, don't be snobbish. The Europeans were before we were, and we're really the little kid on the block, the new kid on the block, and they're the old, established people. And just don't go over there and act like you know everything and that you have everything, and go over there humble. And remember, the Europeans are our old parents. And then missionaries face discouragement and spiritual exhaustion. You know, they don't have revivals like we have to revive ourselves and be stirred up, and they have little fellowship sometimes with other missionaries. And I read about the ones in Brazil, and sometimes once a year, maybe twice a year, they'll gather all the missionaries together just for getting together for fellowship, and they'll call somebody from the States and come preach to them so that they will have encouragement like we have here in our country. And discouragement sometimes in results with witnessing and church growth and converts growth. They face all of that. But we must pray for our missionaries. And when I think of missionaries, I think of these very dedicated, separated servants of God who have not kept their lives for themselves, but lost it for the greater cause of Jesus Christ. And when I think about missionaries, I think about praying and paying. We got to pray for them, and we got to pay for them to go. And it's not reasonable. It is reasonable to believe that when you make the case for missions from Scripture, that good, godly people, when rightly challenged, will respond with their money. And I think, Toby, you've probably found that. And I found that in my church. When we lay the burden out there in front of good, godly people, they will respond to the burden and give their money and send missionaries. They get it. They see the eternal values of giving. But I really don't think it's as easy to convince people, the saints, of the need of praying for them. It's much more difficult to get them to pray for them than it is to give. It's easy to reason that when you give your money, I've done my part. And it's difficult for people sometimes to earnestly and persistently pray for missionaries. And because real praying requires giving up of ourselves, you know, for me, it's easier to go outside and cut the grass than it is to pray. And you men and women that are honest will admit that. It's easier to go wash the dishes than it is to pray. Because when you get down and pray, you got to wrestle, and you got to talk to God, and you got to fight the flesh. And I want to speak to you very briefly tonight in the time that I have left on the two parables taught on persistent praying. And in the context, the Lord had been praying, and he was stopped by his disciples, and they asked him to teach them how to pray. And you know that the answer to that was he gave them what we know as the model prayer. And the important ingredients in that prayer is that we praise and worship God. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then we remember his kingdom yet to be established on this earth is going to come. And the life, this life in the world is not where it is. It's coming, coming kingdom. And then we surrender to God's will. Thy will be done. And then we ask for material needs. What we have, give us this day our daily bread. And we ask forgiveness for our sins. And God's leading us in the right path. And great instruction on reaching the throne room of heaven. But there's a problem. When we pray with these ingredients in our prayers the Lord prescribed, the answer does not always come immediately. Sometimes the Lord delays the answer, and you know, I need this message, and you need this message, that God doesn't always give it right when we ask, and sometimes it's weeks or even months, and silence, and no hints, and no little handfuls on purpose, and nothing from God. And this good God who loves his children and has promised to hear their cry, and we say, where is he? Why won't he answer me? And, you know, if you read that, then you notice that immediately there was no lapse. The Lord, after he gives the instruction on how to pray, that he goes immediately into this prayer of persistence, which means that it's an integral part of prayer. When we pray, an integral part of our praying is persistence. We wait and persist. And this blows out of the water that name it and claim it and blab it and grab it, as some lady in our church used to say, and demand it from God. And it blows all that out of the water. It just doesn't come like that. Faith waits and persists when it seems like God is completely forgotten. And faith sees through the fog and the dark clouds. So this is the spirit of the attitude of prayer. It's personal and private. You don't just drop your prayer coin into God's machine and immediately all the answers are dispensed. We're not robotic in our approach. It's no heart, no life if we act like robots. You know, it's true. If God instantly answered all of our prayers, we'd become very proud and self-righteous and demanding. But isn't it amazing that God not only tells us to pray, and he tells us what to pray in the model prayer, but he tells us what works in praying. And what works is that you keep on praying. And when there's no immediate answer, we interpret that to mean, well, the answer is no, and God doesn't care, or that maybe he's on a journey, or maybe he's asleep. So we give up and we faint. So the Lord teaches persistence in praying, to keep on and not quitting. And he does it with two parables, and one here and one in chapter 18. And it's the parable of the unjust judge, and earthly stories that my pastor used to say with heavenly meaning. And it's a method of bringing truth down to where we can understand it and make it digestible and comprehensible. And we preachers need not to neglect the parables, because they're rich and powerful with great truths in them. And he didn't put them there for us to ignore. The parable of the talents, by the way, is a very powerful motivational tool in the hands of a preacher. The parable of the laborers of the vineyard contains the greatest lesson I've ever found anywhere in the Bible on our attitude toward Christian service. So, the parable of the friend at midnight and the unjust judge are parables on persistence in praying. I have an unsaved daughter, and she has made professions of faith, but if she went on trial for being a Christian, there is neither a preponderance of the evidence that is required in civil cases, nor is there a beyond a reasonable doubt required in criminal cases. There isn't enough evidence to convince her of being a Christian. And I love my daughter, and she loves me, but I'll never quit praying for her till I know she's right with God. And I'm going to persist, and you have loved ones that you're praying for. Now let me tell you briefly about this friend at midnight. It's called also the parable of the importunate friend. And importunate means demanding, persistent, to trouble somebody with demands. And you understand that we don't demand anything of God, and we can persistently plead with God, but we don't demand that he do anything. And in this parable, there was a man who had a visitor come to him at midnight. You know the story probably, you've read it. And he had come on a long journey and didn't get there till midnight, and the householder didn't have any bread to give him, didn't have any food to give him. So he says, well, I'll go over to my friend. He lives over here, and I'll go get some food. It was midnight. And so he asked him to get up and get out of bed and unlock the door and get him some bread. There are several negatives surrounding this unreasonable request. And it's midnight. What an hour to go to a friend with a request like this. Somebody said foul moods are normal at midnight. And why he could be hungry till morning. I've gone to bed hungry before, and I didn't die during the night. And there are no harmful side effects to going to bed hungry. But isn't it wonderful that there's no unreasonable hour to pray? Amen. You can pray at any time. And God never sleeps, never takes a journey. He's everywhere present at once. That's part of our theology. And he never goes on vacation. The door to the throne room is always open, and God is always available. We can pray at any time, in the shower, in the car, in church, out of church, anywhere. And then secondly, it is an unreasonable request because his friend and the family are in bed. They're not night people. They go to bed and go to sleep. The negatives are that it's midnight, his friend is in bed, his children are asleep, and the door is locked and secured. And this is an unreasonable hour. It's an unreasonable demand. And so his friend said, I'm not doing it. I'm not waking up my children. I'm not unlocking the door and taking the pins and the bolts out of it. You come back tomorrow morning and I'll give you something to eat, but not now. And the positives on this are he's a friend. He has a real need. It's not a selfish prayer. It's not for himself. It's not for his own needs. And these are very compelling motives to get his friend out of bed to give him this food. And to grant this request now, he's got to get his whole family awake because the door is bolted. The family is secured inside for the night. Very inconvenient, unreasonable hour. But this is not a selfish request. The bread is for somebody else. Too much of our prayer is for selfish gain to enhance us in the world. James said it like this, that you may consume it upon your lust. It's not for the souls of others and the pain and suffering of others. Too much of our praying is selfish. And missionaries sometimes are almost completely forgotten. But he refused. This man said, no, I won't give it to you. Come back in the morning, and when it's more convenient, I'll give it to you. And you know, sometimes God does say, no, go away, and it's not now, and you wait, and come back later, and I'll give it to you. And we don't want to become proud and demanding with God. Let me digress for a moment. There's a story in the Bible of a Syrophoenician woman who was a Greek woman who came to Christ to ask if he would cast a demon out of her daughter. And the answer that he gave was, let the children, the Jews, be first filled. And it's not right to take the children's bread, the Jews, and give it to the dogs. And the dogs here are the Gentiles. And it's not only a put off, it's a put down. He puts this woman down. And the Lord momentarily assumes the role of this very typical arrogant Jew, because that's the way they looked at Gentiles. And so she had two options. She can walk away crying with her feelings trampled upon and complaining about another arrogant, condescending, compassionless Jew, and her daughter still tormented by this demon, crying with no peace and hearing voices and perhaps led into some awful sin by the demon. And what a predicament for a mom to be in. What am I going to do? When your feelings are worn on your sleeve and you're so easily hurt and so quickly offended and can't take a rebuke or put down or be mistreated, there's two things that are true of you. Number one, you don't love God's word. Psalm 119 says, great peace have they who love thy law, and nothing shall offend them. You know, some people look at a football huddle and think they're talking about them. And number two, if you are easily offended and you wear your feelings on the sleeve, you're proud and in love with yourself. It's spelled Pride. They offended me. How dare them? They don't know who I am. So the Greek woman didn't have any exalted opinions of herself. She wasn't proud. She wasn't super sensitive. She didn't walk off with her feelings bleeding from being called a Gentile dog and being told she was inferior to the Jews. It didn't bother her. I mean, she exercised the second option. She came back persistently with great faith that would not say no. And she loved her hurting daughter more than she did her pride and her fragile feelings. And she knew that Jesus Christ could help her. Yes, she said, but the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the table of the children. And I want to tell you, that is wonderful. She had great faith. And it wasn't an intellectual answer. It was just a humble answer of faith, true humility. She was very persistent. I mean, why is it we quit so soon in asking God for things? He cares, and he says, keep on praying and get a hold of the list of missionaries and pray for them and ask God about their needs. He's testing you. Keep on praying. There's a verse in Matthew 11:12 that says, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. And people read that in the King James. They say, what in the world does that mean? And if you do a word study, the word suffer, of course, means allows, tolerates. The kingdom of heaven tolerates violence, and the violent take it by force. And the image here is of the storming of a city or invading or seizing a kingdom. And violence means spiritual assaults, impassioned earnestness, and indomitable resolution in the pursuit of the Christian life or prayer. So we keep on praying. And let me tell you, the end of the story was that the Lord healed her daughter, and she was well. A wonderful end of the story. But let me come back to this friend at midnight. What persistence wouldn't do, friendship wouldn't do, persistence did. I can hear this man making his case, but they're hungry. They came to me at midnight. They came 25 miles today to get to my house. Would you want to go to bed on an empty stomach? And he kept pleading his case before his friend and said, you got to help me. Don't you know in the Old Testament, and this is what God told the prophet to do. I mean, it's lawyer stuff. It has legal overtones to it. He presents his case like a lawyer before the court. He said, you come to me, this is in Isaiah, he said, you give me your arguments when you're praying, and you state your case, and you list your reasons why you want this prayer answered, and I'll listen to you. You just come before me. I'm the judge, and you're the lawyer, and you're making the case. For 2 years, I prayed, and other people, I'm sure, prayed also for property next to us, 3 acres, that we greatly needed. And I quoted those verses out of Isaiah, and I said, Lord, I'm going to make my case before you. And I made it yesterday. I'm going to make it again today. I did that for 2 years. I said, Lord, we need those 3 acres. We've got to have them. We don't have any room to expand or grow. And to make a long story short, in a miraculous way, the man bought that property, and he's putting all these big townhouses on it. But he left the front part of it next to us. He said, I'm going to sell that. And this was road frontage, 150-some, 90-some feet of road frontage on a highway. And I persisted, and people persisted in praying and kept asking and pleading their case. You know, I like to hear what's going on in missionaries' lives and ministering on the field so I can help them and argue their case before the great judge. And you can do that. I don't have any special right or privilege to do that. So here in Luke 11, the friend at midnight parable is followed by ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened to you. And people say, well, you know, that's for sinners. We need to pray for sinners and keep on asking and keep on knocking. But Greek students love to draw attention to the present imperative tense of the verbs here, noting that the present tense, as Toby learned in Greek class, the tense of continuous action in the present. And it is ask and keep on asking, seek and keep on seeking, and knock and keep on knocking. And that is what is here. So we're supposed to do that, persist, and we can't quit. Probably 80% of you, maybe 90% of you have loved ones that are not saved. Let me tell you, persist in praying for them. Don't ever give up praying for them. Then, very briefly, the parable of the unjust judge in Luke 18:1. He spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. And notice again in the very next verse, he immediately goes into another parable on persistence. It cannot be unconnected to prayer. An integral part of our praying life is that we keep on praying. And there was a judge who was ungodly. He didn't fear God or man, and he had no sense of accountability or justice to anybody. And he wasn't responsible to no human being. And this widow woman came to him. She had been taken advantage of some way and treated unfairly, and she wants the unjust judge to make things right. She wants a redress of her grievances. And she seeks fairness and justice from this judge. And for a while, he didn't pay any attention to her. All her words fell on deaf ears. And did you ever feel like God was deaf? Like he wasn't hearing you? And there's nothing, no signals from heaven, nothing, no verses that leap out at you. There's no say, well, God's going to do this. There's just nothing. Just heaven's sort of walled up. It's brazen skies. And you say, Lord, are you there? Are you listening? But finally, this unjust judge relented, not out of a sense of responsibility or fear of God or fear of the woman, but Christ called him the unjust judge. The judge said, she troubles me and she wearies me. She keeps on asking and asking me, and she won't leave me alone. You know, when my kids were growing up, sometimes they would say, and I know you fathers probably experienced this, they would say, please, Daddy, please, Daddy. And they wanted something from you. And many times, just about the time I was ready to give in, they quit asking. And so I quit giving. And if they would have persisted, I would have done it. And, you know, God's like that. He responds to persistence. We keep asking. It's not a selfish prayer. And we lay out our arguments. We give him our reasons. This is why I need this. And let me tell you, his bank isn't empty. It's not broke. He can give you thousands of dollars. And I'm praying now that we'll be able to pay off that property. We paid $270,000 for it. And I'm asking God to help us pay it off. And you know what's going to happen? We're going to pay it off. Because God's going to answer our prayers if we persist in praying for it. So, Jesus said, do you know what the unjust judge is saying to us? Do you get the lesson? He asked the disciples. You know what you're supposed to learn from this? Do you know what I'm trying to teach you? God will avenge his own elect and hear their prayers and right their cause. You know, I don't like it when missionaries write letters to us and they say, would you pray for this person? Would you pray for this situation? And then I never hear the answer. Did God answer the prayer? I want to know. So I've made up my mind. I'm going to write a letter and send it out to all our missionaries and say, please, when you mention a prayer request, let us know what happened about the prayer request. Is that need still there? Do you need a green card, or do you need to get a visa for a year instead of 6 months? What do you need? Housing? Do you need to get rid of that car with 180,000 miles on it? Let me know what happened, because I'm praying for that. And I want to know when to stop praying for it. So, Sandra Goodwin wrote this. She said, "Last night I took a journey to a land across the seas. I did not go by boat or plane. I traveled on my knees. I saw so many people there in deepest depths of sin, but Jesus told me I should go, and there were souls to win. But I said, 'Jesus, I cannot go and work with such as these.' He answered quickly, 'Yes, you can, by traveling on your knees.' He said, 'You pray, I'll meet the need. You call, and I will hear. Be concerned about lost souls of those both far and near.' And so I tried it, knelt in prayer, gave up some hours of ease. I felt the Lord right by my side while traveling on my knees. And I prayed as I prayed on, and saw souls saved and twisted bodies healed, and saw God's workers' strength renewed while laboring in the field. I said, 'Yes, Lord, I have a job. My desire, thy will to please. I can go and heed thy call by traveling on my knees.'" And that's why you and I can never, ever quit praying. And whatever troubles us, and whatever burdens us, and whatever needs our missionaries have, we're here to bear it like Paul. And remember what Jesus said, "I tell you, he will avenge them speedily." The idea is he will make things right. He'll fix the situation. So don't faint. Keep pleading your case, giving your arguments. Lord, they'll go to hell forever. You know, I have people in Morgantown that I pray for every day. I pray for my wife's brother. I pray for my 2 sisters that are lost. I pray for 3 brothers-in-law that I have are lost. And Lord, would you deal with them? Would you convict them? I can't make them aware of their sin. Show them that they're sinners and they're going to hell. Show them like you showed me. And you know what? If you persist, God is out there to hear your prayers and answer them. Don't ever give up. And he spoke a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. Don't give up. Don't faint. Don't stop. Because God answers prayer. Amen. Make your case. Act like a lawyer. He's the great judge. He wants you. He invites you to lay out your case before him. Give him your reasons. And he'll listen to them. Isn't that wonderful that we have a God like that? That will listen to my pleading of my case before him. Now, if it's old frivolous stuff, then don't bother. But if it's serious stuff, and sometimes God gives us things that maybe aren't greatly important to the world, but a little thing. One time I needed a pencil, and I was on a paper route, and I was collecting this money from people on my paper route, and it was on Saturday morning, and I couldn't remember who was putting money in the mailbox and who wasn't. I didn't have a pencil to write it down. I said, "Lord, I need a pencil. Before I get off the street, I need a pencil." And I looked down on the ground, and there was a pencil. And I had to chew the wood off so I could get to the lead. But I'll tell you, God put the pencil there for me so I could write it down. I wrote down all those men who paid me 50 cents or $1 for their paper. And he's a wonderful God, and he answers prayer. Pray for your missionaries. It's very, very important. You lay up treasures in heaven. They need our prayers as much or more than they need our money. Would you do it? Would you commit to praying for them? Let's bow our heads.